Hey everyone, this week I'm covering something that I started talking about in my very first video, how we acquired much of our western land under the presidency of James Polk. This is Jessica. Last week I discussed Columbus and the earliest history of Europeans in America to show how history can be biased and the difference between a winner's history and a people's history. This week we'll mostly cover the Mexican-American War, which is what led us to acquiring the land that would become California, Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico, as well as parts of Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Some common American themes can be seen in this war: violence to acquire land that doesn't belong to us, propaganda to legitimize this violence, and the use of false patriotism to gain support for the war. I will again be reading from Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. On we go. Hey, this is Future Brad, and I'm just interjecting a quick disclaimer. This is the last week of Amateur Hour. I got a new microphone, and I'm taking some other tips from comments and daughters, and check this out. How cool is that? So, next week, better stuff. Welcome back. I still have Jessica here with me. You can't see her, but she's laying here on the desk. She's one of my little kitty cats. All right, let me find the chapter about James Polk and the Mexican-American War. It is Chapter 8. We take nothing by conquest, thank God. Sarcasm, because we take everything by conquest. Hey, buddy. Hey, girl. All right, there's going to be a bit of the first chapter right off the bat to set the scene. Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock, a professional soldier, graduate of the military academy, commander of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, a reader of Shakespeare, Chaucer, Hegel, Spinoza, wrote in his diary, Fort Jessup, Louisiana, June 30th, 1845. Orders came last evening by express from Washington City, directing General Taylor to move without delay to some point on the coast near the Sabine or elsewhere. Whoa, Jessica. She can't help it. She's a cat. And that scared her and she left. All right, anyway. To move without any delay to some point on the coast. Hello. Some point on the coast near the Sabine or elsewhere. I don't know what the Sabine is, but there it is. And as soon as he shall hear of the acceptance by the Texas Convention of the annexation resolution of our Congress, he is immediately to proceed with his whole command to the extreme western border of Texas and take up a position on the banks of or near the Rio Grande, and he is to expel any armed forces of Mexicans who may cross that river. Did they really like long sentences in 1845? Bliss read the order to me last evening, hastily at tattoo. I have scarcely slept a wink, thinking of the needful preparations. I am now noting at reveille by candlelight and waiting the signal for muster. Violence leads to violence, and if this movement of ours does not lead to others and to bloodshed, I am much mistaken. Hitchcock was not mistaken. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase had doubled the territory of the United States, extending it to the Rocky Mountains. To the southwest was Mexico, which had won its independence in a Revolutionary War against Spain in 1821. A large country which included Texas and what are now New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, and part of Colorado. After agitation and aid from the United States, Texas broke off from Mexico in 1836 and declared itself the Lone Star Republic. In 1845, the U.S. Congress brought it into the Union as a state. In the White House now was James Polk, a Democrat, an expansionist is putting it lightly, who, on the night of his inauguration, confided to his Secretary of the Navy that one of his main objectives was the acquisition of California. His order to General Taylor to move troops to the Rio Grande was a challenge to the Mexicans. It was not at all clear that the Rio Grande was the southern boundary of Texas, although Texas had forced the defeated Mexican, General Santa Anna, to say so when he was a prisoner. The traditional border between Texas and Mexico had been the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the north, and both Mexico and the United States had recognized that as the border. However, Polk, encouraging the Texans to accept annexation, had assured them he would uphold their claims to the Rio Grande. Ordering troops to the Rio Grande into territory inhabited by Mexicans was clearly a provocation. Taylor had once denounced the idea of the annexation of Texas, but now that he had his marching orders, his attitude seemed to change. His visit to the tent of his aide Hitchcock to discuss the move is described in Hitchcock's diary. He seemed to have lost all respect for Mexican rights and is willing to be an instrument of Mr. Polk for pushing our boundary as far west as possible. When I told him that, if he suggested a movement, which he told me he intended, Mr. Polk would seize upon it and throw the responsibility on him. He at once said he would take it, and added that if the president instructed him to use his discretion, he would ask no orders, but would go upon the Rio Grande as soon as he could get transportation. That's all one sentence so far. I think the general wants an additional brevet and would strain a point to get it. He's a poet and he didn't know it. All that was needed in the spring of 1846 was a military incident to begin the war that Polk wanted. It came in April when General Taylor's quartermaster, Colonel Cross, was riding up the Rio Grande and disappeared. His body was found 11 days later, his skull smashed by a heavy blow. It was assumed that he had been killed by Mexican guerrillas crossing the river. In a solemn military ceremony, visible to the Mexicans of Matamoros, crowding onto the roofs of their houses across the Rio Grande, Cross was buried with a religious service and 3 volleys of rifle fire. The next day, April 25th, a patrol of Taylor's soldiers was surrounded and attacked by Mexicans and wiped out. 16 dead, others wounded, the rest captured. Taylor sent a message to the governors of Texas and Louisiana asking them to recruit 5,000 volunteers. He had been authorized to do this by the White House before he left for Texas, and he sent a dispatch to Polk. Hostilities may now be considered commenced. The Mexicans had fired the first shot, but they had done what the American government wanted, according to Colonel Hitchcock, who wrote in his diary even before those first incidences. Incidences is maybe not a word. I have said from the first that the United States are the aggressors. We have not one particle of right to be here. It looks as if the government sent a small force on purpose to bring on a war, so as to have a pretext for taking California and as much of this country as it chooses, for whatever becomes of this army, there is no doubt of a war between the United States and Mexico. My heart is not in this business, but as a military man, I am bound to execute orders. So in other words, Polk sent a small force at first, because he just wanted to incite an incident, get the Mexicans to fire at them, which they did. If they had sent a big force at first, Mexico might have held back and not attacked them. But since it was just a small force, they could. But they already had orders to summon up another 5,000 volunteers after an incident happened, which they knew it would. So soon after, Polk called a cabinet meeting. Polk recorded in his diary what he said in the cabinet meeting. I stated that up to this time, as we knew, we had heard of no open act of aggression by the Mexican army, but that the danger was imminent that such acts would be committed. I said that in my opinion we had ample cause of war and that it was impossible that I could remain silent much longer, and the country was excited and impatient on the subject. The country was not excited and impatient, but the President was. When the dispatches arrived from General Taylor telling of casualties from the Mexican attack, Polk summoned the cabinet to hear the news, and they unanimously agreed we should ask for a declaration of war. Polk's message to Congress was indignant. The cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte, the Rio Grande, and now, after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. As war exists, notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself, we are called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate with decision the honor, the rights, and the interests of our country. Doesn't this sound just like a Trump speech, although Polk was much more articulate than Trump could ever hope to be in a million years? But saying that we took every effort to avoid war, but we can't help it because Mexico fired at us. When the exact opposite is true, that they were trying to incite a war. They sacrificed some American soldiers to start this war. They knew that they would be attacked, and they were. It's just ridiculous. At least there could be honesty. Abraham Lincoln of Illinois was not yet in Congress when the war began. But after his election in 1846, he had the occasion to vote and speak on the war. His spot resolutions became famous. He challenged Polk to specify the exact spot where American blood was shed on the American soil. But he would not try to end the war by stopping funds for men and supplies. Speaking in the House on July 27, 1848, in support of the candidacy of General Zachary Taylor for president, he said, "But as General Taylor is, par excellence, the hero of the Mexican War, and as you Democrats say, we Whigs have always opposed the war, you think it must be very awkward and embarrassing for us to go for General Taylor. The declaration that we have always opposed the war is true or false according as one may understand the term oppose the war. If to say the war was unnecessary and unconstitutionally commenced by the President, be opposing the war, when the Whigs have very generally opposed it. The marching an army into the midst of a peaceful Mexican settlement, frightening the inhabitants away, leaving their growing crops and other property to destruction, to you may appear a perfectly amiable, peaceful, unprovoking procedure, but it does not appear so to us. But if when the war had begun and had become the cause of the country, the giving of our money and our blood, in common with yours, was supporting of the war, then it is not true that we have always opposed the war. With few individual exceptions, you have constantly had our votes here for all the necessary supplies." A handful of anti-slavery congressmen voted against all war measures, seeing the Mexican campaign as a means of extending the southern slave territory. One of these was Joshua Giddings of Ohio, a fiery speaker, physically powerful, who called it an aggressive, unholy, and unjust war. He explained his vote against supplying arms and men. In the murder of Mexicans upon their soil, or in robbing them of their country, I can take no part, either now or hereafter. The guilt of these crimes must rest on others. I will not participate in them. Giddings pointed to the British Whigs, who during the American Revolution announced in Parliament in 1776 that they would not vote supplies for a war to oppress Americans. So we see again, even while there are people doing immoral things, starting unnecessary wars, killing people, there's always someone, in this case Lincoln and this other fella, Giddings, who try to stand up to those things. Just like now, there are people who are trying not to fund ICE because, well, Trump's private army. They're trying not to fund it because they don't approve of the actions. But unfortunately, the sane voices, the calm voices, the moral voices generally get drowned out by the loud voices. Speaking of California, the Illinois State Registrar asked, "Shall this garden of beauty be suffered to lie dormant in its wild and tasteless luxuriance. So once again, if land isn't being used in the way people think it should be, it's being wasted. Myriads of enterprising Americans would flock to its rich and inviting prairies. The hum of Anglo-American industry would be heard in its valleys. Cities would rise upon its plains and seacoast, and the resources and wealth of the nation be increased in an incalculable degree. The American Review talked of Mexicans yielding to a superior population, insensibly oozing into her territories, changing her customs and outliving, outtraining, exterminating her weaker blood. The New York Herald was saying, by 1847, the universal Yankee nation can regenerate and disenthrall the people of Mexico in a few years, and we believe it is part of the destiny to civilize that beautiful country. So once again, we civilize things that they are squandering. I hate that theme. The Congressional Globe of February 11th, 1847 reported, Mr. Giles of Maryland, I take it for granted that we shall gain territory, and must gain territory, before we shut the gates of the Temple of Janus. We must march from ocean to ocean. We must march from Texas straight to the Pacific Ocean and be bounded only by its roaring wave. It is the destiny of the white race. It is the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon race. Maybe you can answer me this. Gates of the Temple of Janus? Is that a Bible thing or is that a Greek thing? I don't really know. Considering the strenuous efforts of the nation's leaders to build patriotic support, the amount of open dissent and criticism was remarkable. Anti-war meetings took place in spite of attacks by patriotic mobs. So, once again, history repeating. There were anti-war meetings, just as they were for Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and they were attacked by patriotic mobs. So patriotic means that you support whatever war is happening. And as usual, they're the violent people who are attacking the peaceful protesters. All right, skipping ahead a bit. Some newspapers at the very start of the war protested. Horace Greeley wrote in the New York Tribune, May 12, 1846, "We can easily defeat the armies of Mexico, slaughter them by thousands, and pursue them perhaps to their capital. We can conquer and annex their territory. But what then? Have the histories of the ruin of Greek and Roman liberty consequent on such extensions of empire by the sword no lesson for us? Who believes that a score of victories over Mexico, the annexation of half her provinces, will give us more liberty, a purer morality, a more prosperous industry than we now have? Is not life miserable enough? Comes not death soon enough without the resort to hideous enginery of war?" So comparing us conquering to what the Greeks and Romans did when they formed their empires. And yes, America could be considered an empire. And it doesn't generally end well, as we may soon find out. Skipping ahead a bit to talking about the army itself that was fighting this war. We know much more about the American army, volunteers, not conscripts, lured by money and opportunity for social advancement via promotion in the armed forces. Half of General Taylor's armies were recent immigrants, Irish and German mostly, whereas in 1830, 1% of the population of the United States was foreign-born. By the Mexican War, the number was reaching 10%. Their patriotism was not very strong. Their belief in all arguments for expansion paraded in the newspapers was probably not great. Indeed, many of them deserted to the Mexican side, enticed by money. Some enlisted in the Mexican army and formed their own battalion, the San Patricio, standing for St. Patrick's Battalion. At first, there seemed to be enthusiasm in the army, fired by pay and patriotism. Martial spirit was high in New York, where the legislature authorized the governor to call 50,000 volunteers. Placards read, "Mexico or death." There was a mass meeting of 20,000 people in Philadelphia. 3,000 volunteered in Ohio. This initial spirit soon wore off. A woman in Greensboro, North Carolina, recorded in her diary, Tuesday, January 5th, 1847. Today was a general muster and speeches by Mr. Gorrell and Mr. Henry. General Logan received them in the street and requested all the volunteers to follow after. As he walked up and down the street, I saw some 6 or 7 bad-looking persons following, with poor Jim Lane in front. I don't know what Jim Lane did to this person. How many poor creatures have been and are still to be sacrificed upon the altar of pride and ambition? Oh, millions more. Posters appealed for volunteers in Massachusetts. Men of old Essex, men of Newburyport, rally around the bold, gallant, and lion-hearted Cushing. He will lead you to victory and to glory. They promised pay of $7 to $10 a month and spoke of federal bounty of $24 and 160 acres of land. But one young man wrote anonymously to the Cambridge Chronicle, "Neither have I the least idea of joining you or in any way assisting the unjust war against Mexico. I have no wish to participate in such glorious butcheries of women and children as were displayed in the capture of Monterey, etc. Neither have I any desire to place myself under the dictation of a petty military tyrant, to every caprice of whose will I must yield implicit obedience. No siree. As long as I can work, beg, or go to the poorhouse, I won't go to Mexico to be lodged on the damp ground, half starved, half roasted, bitten by mosquitoes and centipedes, stung by scorpions and tarantulas, marched, drilled, and flogged, and then stuck up to be shot at, for $8 a month and putrid rations. Well, I won't. Human butchery has had its day, and the time is rapidly approaching when the professional soldier will be placed on the same level as a bandit, the Bedouin, and the thug." Reports grew of men forced to be volunteers and pressed for service. One James Miller of Norfolk, Virginia, protested that he had been persuaded, quote, "by the influence of an unusual quantity of ardent spirits," end quote, to sign a paper enrolling for military service. Next morning I was dragged aboard of a boat, landed at Fort Monroe, and closely immured in the guardhouse for 16 days. So they got him drunk, got him to sign, dragged him on a boat, and put him in a guardhouse for 16 days so he couldn't leave. More about the California part of the war. It was a separate war that went on in California, where Anglo-Americans raided Spanish settlements, stole horses, and declared California separate from Mexico, the Bear Flag Republic. Indians lived there. A naval officer, Revere, gathered the Indian chiefs and spoke to them, as he later recalled. "I have called you together to have a talk with you. The country you inhabit no longer belongs to Mexico, but to a mighty nation whose territory extends from the great ocean you have all seen or heard of, to another great ocean thousands of miles toward the rising sun. I am an officer of that great country, and to get here, have traversed both of those great oceans in a ship of war, which, with a terrible noise, spits forth flames and hurls forth instruments of destruction, dealing death to all our enemies. Our armies are now in Mexico, and will soon conquer the whole country. But you have nothing to fear from us if you do what is right. If you are faithful to your new rulers, we come to prepare this magnificent region for the use of other men, for the population of the world demands more room, and here is the room enough for many millions, who will hereafter occupy and till the soil. But in admitting others, we shall not displace you, if you act properly. You can easily learn, but you are indolent. I hope you will alter your habits, and be industrious and frugal, and give up all the low vices which you practice. But if you are lazy and dissipated, you must before many years become extinct. We shall watch over you and give you true liberty, but beware of sedition, lawlessness, and all other crimes, for the army which shields can assuredly punish, and it will reach you in your most retired hiding places." So this doofus general is telling the Native Americans that they can either join or be punished, but they can't continue the way they are in their current culture, because that just won't work with what America wants of them. General Taylor had moved across the Rio Grande. Sorry, I got interrupted by my dog there for a second. Before I get back, I'm going to be adding James Polk to my timeline. And I saw a TikTok live where someone was ranking all of the presidents. And they had George Washington on the top line as the best. The second line, they had Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and James Polk. And I asked why James Polk was listed so high, and they said because he doubled the size of the country by adding all of these states that we took from Mexico. And I'm not sure if that is such an awesome thing to have done. If Trump were to take Greenland soon, in 100 years, would we rank him as one of the best presidents for adding all of that land? I know I wouldn't. Maybe there's more to James Polk that I don't yet know, but at the moment he seems like kind of a dick. All right. General Taylor had moved across the Rio Grande, occupied Matamoros, and now moved southward through Mexico. But his volunteers became more unruly on Mexican territory. Mexican villages were pillaged. One officer wrote in his diary in the summer of 1846, "We reached Barita around 5 p.m. Many of the Louisiana volunteers were there, a lawless, drunken rabble. They had driven away the inhabitants, taken possession of their houses, and were emulating each other in making beasts of themselves. Cases of rape began to multiply." So once again, just like last week, are we just awful people? And people in general. After Taylor's army took Monterey, he reported some shameful atrocities by the Texas Rangers, and he sent them home when their enlistment expired. But others continued robbing and killing Mexicans. A group of men from a Kentucky regiment, broke into one Mexican dwelling, threw out the husband, and raped his wife. Mexican guerrillas retaliated with cruel vengeance. Well, I can't really blame Mexicans for retaliating when we're doing stuff like that. In the final battle for Mexico City, Anglo-American troops took the height of Chapultepec and entered the city of 200,000 people. General Santa Anna, having moved northward, this was September 1847. A Mexican merchant wrote to a friend about the bombardment of the city. In some cases, whole blocks were destroyed, and a great number of men, women, and children killed and wounded. General Santa Anna fled to Huamantla, kind of like Atlanta, but with a hua at the beginning, where another battle was fought, and he had to flee again. An infantry lieutenant wrote to his parents what happened after an officer named Walker was killed in battle. General Lane told us to avenge the death of the gallant Walker, to take all we could lay hands on. And well and fearfully was his mandate obeyed. Grog shops were broken open first, and then, maddened with liquor, every species of outrage was committed. Old women and girls were stripped of their clothing, and many suffered still greater outrages. Men were shot by dozens, their property, churches, stores, and dwelling houses ransacked. By the way, this is what current, I'm not going to say the military at all, but current people in Trump's little private army would be doing if there weren't cameras everywhere, I guarantee. Dead horses and men lay about pretty thick, while drunken soldiers, yelling and screeching, were breaking open houses or chasing some poor Mexicans who had abandoned their houses and fled for life. Such a scene I never hope to see again. It gave me a lamentable view of human nature. It made me, for the first time, ashamed of my country. All right, we're almost done. This next part's going to be a little long because I always like to read as much of the end of the chapter as I can. The glory of the victory was for the president and the generals, not the deserters, the dead, the wounded. Of the 2nd Regiment of Mississippi Rifles, 167 died of disease. 2 regiments from Pennsylvania went out 1,800 strong and came home with 600. John Calhoun of South Carolina said in Congress that 20% of the troops had died of battle or sickness. The Massachusetts Volunteers had started with 630 men. They came home with 300 dead, mostly from disease, and at the reception dinner on their return, their commander, General Cushing, was hissed by his men. The Cambridge Chronicle wrote, "Charges of the most serious nature against one and all of these military officials dropped daily from the lips of the volunteers." As the veterans returned home, Speculators immediately showed up to buy the land warrants given by the government. Many of the soldiers, desperate for money, sold their 160 acres for less than $50. The New York Commercial Advertiser said in June 1847, "It is a well-known fact that immense fortunes were made out of the poor soldiers who shed their blood in the Revolutionary War by speculators who preyed upon their distresses. A similar system of depredation was practiced upon the soldiers of the last war." So the soldiers were promised 160 acres to go to war. They come home, they get certificates for their acreage, but they've been gone. Their families are probably poor and starving, and the soldiers who just came home may be sick or injured, and so they sell their 160 acres for way less money than they're worth. And once again, the rich get richer, as is always the case. Mexico surrendered. There were calls among Americans to take all of Mexico. I'm surprised we didn't. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed February 1848, just took half. The Texas boundary was set at the Rio Grande. New Mexico and California were ceded. The United States paid Mexico $15 million, which led the Whig intelligencer to conclude that, sarcastically, "We take nothing by conquest, thank God." So we took a whole bunch of land through a war that was started not necessarily morally, that we kind of instigated. We went to pick a fight, more or less. Maybe you remember that line from Braveheart. And I'm sure in history books it will say that America acquired this land through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and we paid Mexico $15 million for the land, making it sound as though we just signed a treaty, got some land from Mexico. And it wouldn't have mentioned the way we got the soldiers to fight in the war, what we promised them, how many died of disease, that we were raping Mexicans, that we marched all the way to Mexico City to make sure they were fully conquered and that we would get all the land at a cheap price. America's built on murder, it seems to me, in many cases. It's not great. Thanks for taking the time to watch or listen. Have a good one.